Okay, so we're going to begin here with God's purpose for marriage, and we're going to talk about some things that have to do with healthy relationships and how that we as couples can actually fulfill God's purpose in being couples so that we can demonstrate the qualities of His own nature. Because as we said earlier, the Lord God said, "It's not good that man should be alone. I'll make him a helper comparable to him." And in making this statement, He revealed, as I said earlier, a problem that He Himself had, that He needed someone that was compatible with His nature to whom He could relate, so that the characteristics, and the attributes of His nature and that which makes God could be demonstrated. So I want to look at two verses of Scripture in Genesis chapter 2, which reveal the four fundamentals of marriage. These are Genesis 2:24 and 25. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh. They were both naked, and the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed." So I'm going to break it down now to these are the four fundamentals of marriage. Number one is separation, where a man shall leave his father and his mother. And this is one of the areas that is so very important for a marriage, because a lot of times in marriages there are in-law problems. You know, the proverbial mother-in-law who just won't let go of the so-called the apron strings of her son. And so she comes into the marriage and brings considerable amount of disruptive influences into the marriage. But that's the first fundamental, is their separation, that we must come out of our father's house and be joined and connected to our spouse, so that in that connection we can establish a complete new environment and a new entity. And when we do that, it's not that we are dishonoring our parents. It's not that we are dishonoring them in the way of not wanting to fulfill or maintain or perpetuate some of the traditions that they have, but not all the traditions that our parents had are necessarily apropos for us, or what we should bring into our marriage. Well, you might have heard the story about the lady, the mother, who was preparing the roast, and she cut it in half and put it in two pans. How many of you have heard that story? How many have not heard the story? She cut the roast in half, put it in two pans, and prepared it for the dinner. And as she was doing that, her daughter asked her, says, "Mom, why do you cut the roast in half to put it in two pans?" Well, she said, "That's the way my mom always did it." So I'm going to look into this. So they checked with Grandma. "How come did you cut the roast in half and put it in the oven to make that's the way my mom always did it." So we went and checked out the great-grandma, and she said, "Great-grandma, how come did you cut the roast in half when you made it like this? And why did you do that?" She says, "Because I never had a pan big enough for it to put it in one pan." So sometimes there are things that are perpetuated in our relationships that are tradition but have no real value or meaning today. And that's why the first thing is necessary is that we leave our father and a mother, leave the familiar, leave that which has been our nurturing ground, because we're now coming to the place where we can establish something else with our marriage partner. The second part is bonding. Be joined. He shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. That's where there's a oneness that's coming. That's where you come together. You're now actually forming a unit that is specific and unique to that which you have experienced previously. And so when you look at that, it's very important that this bonding is a mental commitment to have a faithful and a permanent relationship with your spouse regardless of difficulties. That's becoming one. Now, it's in that becoming one that there are many challenges presented. And, of course, becoming one is the consummation of the marriage, yes, but there's also a greater degree of becoming one than just becoming sexually one, because there's a need to become one mentally, emotionally, with compatibility. My wife and I, because we've been together so long, sometimes we can almost finish each other's sentences. Sometimes it's scary, but we're so on the same page in so many ways that we actually are. We're thinking alike in so many ways. We weren't always like that. She's the baby of 14, spoiled baby, yeah. And I'm the first and the last. I was the beginning and the end. And so we had a period of adjustment. We had a couple of rocky first years of marriage, and it was not an easy route for us. In fact, we had, after a couple of years of marriage, we had both talked to divorce lawyers. We were going our separate ways. We were calling it quits. We had a couple of years of marriage behind us, or at least a couple of years of being together behind us. We didn't really have marriage. We were just together. We had 2 children. We'd broken all of our marriage vows. And we were just, I used to, when I was coming home from work and when it was dark, I could come up over a little hill and I could see the house. And if the lights were on, I knew she hadn't left me that day. So we were living parallel lives, but we were not together. We were not one in any way. We just were living together, sleeping in the same beds, living in a house. Like I said, had 2 children, but we did not really have a marriage. We were just together. And there is a difference. Then the Lord got a hold of me, and I had a radical conversion, a radical change of heart. And a couple of months later, Marty got back on track because when she started hanging out with me, she got into a backslidden condition, but she had to get back on track with the Lord. But then we had a real problem. And the problem we had was, now we were both Christians. We had 2 children. We were living together in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, but had absolutely no love for each other. Now what do? We didn't have all the resources available today. We didn't have counselors. We didn't have, 10 steps to a happy marriage. We didn't have those things back in the early 60s. So what did we do? Every night when we got ready for bed, we would get on our knees beside each other. We'd put our arms around each other. And I'd pray, Father, give me a love for this woman. And she'd pray, Lord, give me a love for this man. And we did this night after night after night after night until one morning we woke up and we looked at each other, we were in love. We've been growing in that love ever since. Because you see, love is a choice. You choose. Nowhere does the Scripture tell us to marry the person we love. But it does tell us to love the person we've married. There is a difference. Love is a choice. I'm not of the persuasion that there was only one person on the planet that could be my wife. If I'd have been raised in Africa, there'd have been someone there that could fulfill me as a person, and we could demonstrate kingdom life and the attributes of God in that relationship. I don't believe that there is only one person, that like marriages are made in heaven, that If you don't find that particular person, it just won't work, because if that were the case, if one person got out of sync, the whole world would be out of sync. And so you leave your father and your mother, and it's your cleave to us. It's a leave and cleave principle that's here. The second fundamental of marriage is the bonding that comes where you're being joined to your wife in a commitment that's made that is for better or for worse. It's like the little boy, he says, he went to his dad to his wedding, to a friend's wedding, and had never been to a wedding before. And he says, when he got home, he says, "Daddy, how come that man gets to marry 16 wives?" "What do you mean 16 wives?" "Well, the preacher said 4 better, 4 worse, 4 richer, 4 poorer." The third fundamental is oneness. They shall become one flesh. Parenting. That's where, as a result of your union, the physical oneness and the consummation of sexual closeness is how are to achieve lasting oneness. Both of us, both of you, should look for ways to bring pleasure to one another. Openly ask what is pleasurable and take time to enjoy one another. There's no greater joy and no greater sense of pleasure and oneness and the sense of intimacy than in the sexual relationship in the marriage. It's a wonderful place. And yet at the same time, as I said, that's one of the 3 primary areas of where marriages break down, is because there's incompatibility there. And it's very important for couples to really learn compatibility in the marriage bed, because that's God's intention. God made us sexual beings. And he intended sex for pleasure, not just for procreation. And so it's important that we can actually become very compatible. And as Paul wrote, he said that the marriage bed is honorable and undefiled. There are a lot of liberties in the marriage bed as long as there's no one's conscience is being violated in that. And so we find that sometimes couples struggle to really meet each other's needs in that marriage bed. And so they come to us and we discuss those areas. We're mature enough that we can discuss these areas, and we've helped many couples in this period. But it's one of the fundamentals. It's separation, there's bonding, there's oneness, and then it says they were both naked and they were not ashamed. This is where the emotional intimacy takes place, when you seek to be vulnerable and transparent, honestly sharing with one another your feelings of frustration and failure and your deepest disappointments and desires. Spiritual intimacy is achieved when you continue to reveal to one another your unmet needs, praying together, praying for each other, and sharing what God is personally doing in your lives. The greatest need that every woman has is have a sense of security. And the greatest place for her to find that security outside of her relationship with the Lord, or next to her relationship with the Lord, is with her spouse. And so one of the first things that we do when couples come to us when they're having difficulties in their marriage is we ask, especially the wife, because we know she needs security, we ask her if she feels safe with her husband. Probably 70 to 80% of the couples who come to us, the wife says no, she does not feel safe with her husband. Why do I say that? Does that mean she's afraid she's going to get beaten or something? No, it means that she cannot share her emotional needs and actually feel like she's being heard without just being put off. I had a little clip. I didn't know how we were set up here, else I might have played it. It's only about a minute-long clip, but it really puts it into focus, a little clip that I had to advertise our symposium. And what it is this couple who is sitting there on the couch, and he is deeply engrossed in the TV and the game that was going on. And so she's looking at him, and she wants to have communication. So she says, honey, if I died, would you get married again? Oh, well, I'll probably eventually, yeah, so back to the game. So she thinks a little bit, and she says, honey, would you let her drive my car? Oh, probably, yeah. I should appreciate if I didn't. Back to the game. So she thinks a little bit and she says, well, would you allow her to sleep in our bed? Well, I don't know. I probably, yeah, I suppose, sooner or later. Back to the game. She thinks a little bit. She says, honey, would you allow her to wear my clothes? No. She'd be a smaller size. And about that time, she smacks him. And he says, he just doesn't get it. And the next thing you see is she's got him by the throat and she is shaking him like this. But it is a classic demonstration of men who do not pay attention to their wives when they're talking to them. And it's a classic demonstration of why wives do not feel safe with their husbands. Because they're not being heard. And long term, when a wife is not heard and she has to stuff things, it will cause physical problems. Physical problems that are directly related to the emotional needs that are unfulfilled and unmet. Now, on the other hand, husbands need to feel significant. We men want to be Prince Charming. We want to be the man. We want to be the one who the sun rises and sets on, especially to our spouse. But sometimes what we want from our spouse is we try to demand that she honors us without us respecting her and allowing her to also be in the place where she feels absolutely fulfilled because her emotional needs are being properly addressed, and she can be absolutely naked and with no shame. In other words, she can be absolutely open and transparent and let us see right into each other's heart and spirit and being without being ashamed of, I got to cover up, because if I really let you know who I am or what I'm really like, then you're going to devalue me in some form. And so these are four fundamentals of marriage. You got to leave where you've been, leave the single life, because sometimes what we do is we deal with husbands who are married but think like single men. We find that much more than women who are married who think like single girls. But it's important to make that leaving the father and mother, to establish your own home and begin to set some boundaries for your home so that you can create your environment, create your traditions, create that which is right for you so that you can begin to demonstrate what kingdom looks like in your nuclear family. Cleaving through commitment to the wife, to that, and to be bonded and joined together, and then through that oneness that comes the expression of the love and expression of that emotional fulfillment and attachment. As we learn to do that, harmony is a part of our portion. As a result of that, there's health, there's beauty, there's majesty, and there's demonstration of the love, the purpose, the beauty and the glory of what God intended. Because you see, we're all created with three God-given inner needs. The need for love and to be loved, the need for significance, and the need for security. Every one of us need that. That's the reason we have boundaries. That's the reason it's so important for singles to learn how to establish appropriate boundaries before they consider getting married. Because if you don't have appropriate boundaries before you're married, you're going into what can very quickly become a dysfunctional marriage, because the boundaries are not appreciated and respected, and therefore you become codependent upon each other, and it just becomes a quagmire where sooner or later you need help to get it all sorted out. So these needs can be translated into the need to feel heard and understood, to feel discouraged and to feel encouraged and at peace, to feel affirmed and accepted, to feel confident and courageous. Now you see, here's the deal. When our emotional needs are not met, they become the driving force behind the way we respond when we're faced with differences of opinion and conflict. If couples come to us and they're having conflicts in their marriage, we know that the emotional needs are not being met in one or both spouses. You see, if a man's emotional needs are not met at home, he will be prone, unless it's something generational, he'll be prone to become a workaholic so he can get his affirmation at work. If he does not get the affirmation at work, he will be very susceptible to an affair with somebody that will give him the affirmation, because as a man, we are wired for the need of feeling significant. We need significance in our being in order for us to feel complete and as a man. A woman, if she does not feel emotional, have her emotional needs met to where she feels safe in the marriage, she will look for that safety. She will look for that emotional need to be met with either confidants as a woman, or sometimes as a man, depending on the situation. She will find somewhere she is going to find that emotional need met where she feels secure. She may also become a workaholic if that's where she's getting the affirmation and the sense of security that she needs, because that's a God-given wiring that's in us that we can't change. And that's why when we're married as spouses, we have to understand. We need to understand how we think, understand how we relate to issues and circumstances, so we know what our spouse needs, so we can stroke her in that correct way, so she feels complete. And as a result of that, we're being taught, we're learning how to demonstrate patience, long-suffering, love, acceptance, and the various attributes that make God who He is. Because remember, the reason we're here is to represent Him to this generation, and it starts in the home. The home is the cornerstone of society. That's why it's so under fire today. That's why there's so many breakdowns in marriages today. Marriage is supposed to be a safe place where we can be ourselves without fear. We can express our deepest thoughts without disapproval. Where husbands have significance without criticism, and wives have security without compromise. My wife used to enjoy criticizing me to her friends. I said used to. Remember, we've only had one fight. Then she used to, underline used to, try to argue with me. And of course, we process things different. In most couples, one will be a fast processor, one will be a slower processor. Almost inevitably, that's the way it works out. I am very quick on my feet. I have a very fast and quick mind. Marty needs to have a little bit more time to process things. And I've learned to give her that time, give her that space, because just because she needs more time to process things does not make her inferior intellectually. It just simply means she processes information differently. And so I've learned to give her that time. So rather than arguing. But after a while, she learned that it's pretty difficult to argue with yourself. It's no fun at all. But the marriage is a place where we need to feel safe, where we can have a wife can feel have security without compromise. In other words, she does not have to continually compromise her feelings to accommodate her husband's wishes. That's wrong. Neither does the husband in a place where he has to always be criticized because of his need for significance. That's where the relationship comes together, where we complement each other, so that in that complementing of each other, we're actually demonstrating an aspect of the kingdom that is to be completely different and enlightening to the world around us. But unfortunately today, the marriages of the saints have almost the same statistics as the marriages of the ain'ts. That shouldn't be. There should be a difference where we are demonstrating something that's beyond what the ungodly are experiencing. Can you say amen? So one of the first things to learn in a marriage relationships is to learn what your spouse's love languages are. How many of you are familiar with the book, The 5 Love Languages? Some of you are. Excellent book, recommended highly. The 5 love languages are gifts, touch, quality time, works of service, and words of affirmation. Most women fall in the category of either quality time, works of service. That's their love language. That fills their love tank. Most men are in the areas of words of affirmation because of the need to feel significant. Touch comes in there on varying degrees with both spouses. It's very important that we learn what our spouse's love language is, because if that love tank is not filled up, there's going to be irritability, there's going to be a tension, like tension in the relationship, there's going to be stress where stress is not needed at all if the love tank is simply filled up. And so this again is why we did the singles part first, so that we can learn how men and women respond differently in different circumstances and situations. And when we learn that and realize that we're wired differently, then just because something works for me does not necessarily mean it's going to work for you if you're of another gender. And so it's important to learn those areas. And so it's very important that you spend the time to find out. If you don't know what your spouse's love language is, ask her or ask him. What really makes you tick? And usually, or often rather, what happens is what your spouse demonstrates toward you is what he's really subliminally saying is his love language or her love language. And so it's very important that you have that understanding. It's like knowing what's your spouse's favorite color. How many of you know what your spouse's favorite color is? A couple of you do. Well, now let me get really transparent here. How many of you, I'm not asking you what it is, how many of you know what your spouse's primary love language is? A couple of you do. It's important to know that. Because you see, if you're saying, well, I can't understand it, I keep bringing her gifts. I mean, I bring her flowers every couple of weeks, and I buy her this for her, and I buy that for her, and she's never happy. That's because her love language is not gifts. Her love language is probably quality time that you're not giving her because you're glued to the game or something. Or you're busy. Uh-oh, what's happening here? Do what? Oh, the love languages? So it's important that we understand what makes each other tick. Awful quiet in here. I knew a man would respond to that. Let's look at the 3 A's of a marriage relationship: attention, appreciation, and affection. Whenever we deal with premarital instruction for couples preparing for marriage, or even when we deal with married couples, we tell them that there are 3 essential ingredients for a good marriage. There's communication, communication, and communication. Communication in the kitchen, communication in the living room, communication in the bedroom. What do we mean by that? Communication in the kitchen, that's where you're giving attention. That's where you work to establish your finances and work how you're going to operate your family, and how you're going to work with your just developing the home, developing the place of security for children that come along, and that's where you work in those areas. And then you go into the living room. That's how you deal with the in-laws. That's how you deal with the outlaws, and that's how you deal with the workplace, and where you're involved in a greater sphere of influence and your greater social relationships and interactions. And then we also deal with communication in the bedroom, where you get into that intimate areas where it's just the two of you, where you really learn to connect, but first spiritually and then emotionally and then physically. You learn to connect in those areas to where you have a meaningful relationship. And so what you have there is that you have a continual flow, and because people can relate to kitchen, living room, and bedroom, it makes it very simple to break down the areas that we deal with. But it's important to have communication in all of those areas. And we tell couples that the best sex starts in the kitchen. What do I mean by that? It means that you're washing dishes sometimes. It means that you're helping in the kitchen sometimes. And you're doing that because you're letting her you're giving her attention, because you're letting your spouse know that she's appreciated there. And so it's important that we have those. It's a continual flow of communication and interpersonal relationships. Now, if this were a symposium, we would pause right here and we would have a discussion, because that's what a symposium is. A symposium comes back from the Greek times of the philosophers, when they used to sit around and drink wine and discuss new ideas and come to conclusions. And so this isn't a symposium. We're not going to do that. But if it were, we'd have a good, lively discussion about right now. Because we find that when we get into some of these areas, it triggers responses within people. But because we need to keep moving forward, I want to just kind of shift into now some 10 essentials of communication, because communications are absolutely essential in any kind of meaningful relationships. So effective communication is the single most important ingredient for a healthy marriage. In spite of how effectively you can communicate with neighbors, co-workers, and friends, the following principles are essential for meaningful connections with your spouse. Because what happens so many times is we're talking to each other, but we're not connecting with each other. And what needs to happen is we need to do less talking and more connecting. Because communication is, nonverbal communication is as essential and as powerful as actual verbal communication. This is what I said yesterday, what it was about when the couples come and they sit in the love seat that we have, we can kind of tell by how far apart they sit what kind of state their marriage is in. That's why we don't have them sitting on the couch. They get too far apart. There's a method to our madness. Communication. Number one, be sure your spouse is listening. If you need to speak to your spouse about an important or sensitive subject, be sure that he or she is not angry or preoccupied. For some of you, that may mean you need a talking stick. Or you know what a talking stick is? Oh, it's a game that sometimes you play where you have a stick and you hold up the stick when it's your turn to talk. So sometimes you got to hold up. It's my turn to talk now. But you need to look each other in the face, left eye to left eye, that is, so that you could actually have each other's attention. So when you start sharing what your needs are, your expectations are, they're actually being heard. That is the first, number one, fundamental of any kind of meaningful conversation or communication, is to make sure that your spouse is listening. Otherwise, why bother? Why bother? If your spouse is not listening, when you're attempting to communicate with them, it does more damage to you emotionally than if you don't even attempt to make the communication connection. Because every time you try to communicate with your spouse and they're just preoccupied with something else, you read that as being invalidated as a person. You then internalize that, especially as a female, you then internalize that and you put it in your stuffer. You just stuff it. And then you wonder why you have difficult menstrual cycles. You wonder why you have PMS. You wonder why that you have other areas of physical needs that start cropping up. It's because your stuffer has been filled up and it has no place to go, and so it has to manifest physically. On the other hand, if a husband tries to communicate with his wife and she doesn't listen when he's trying to communicate with her, he will find somebody to listen to him. The enemy will make sure of that. And so when we deal with couples with affairs who have infidelity, we don't right away shake the finger at the one who jumped the fence. We find out why they jumped the fence. What was going on, what emotional needs were not being met that caused you to have to go outside of your commitment to try to find that place of fulfillment that you crave and desire. Because all of us are wired for relationship. And if we don't have it at home, we will find it someplace. Are you with me? Number 2, begin with something positive. Whenever you need to have a serious discussion with anyone, it's always advisable to begin with something positive. How many of you ever heard of the little tiny book that came out about 20 years ago called The 1 Minute Manager? Excellent little book on communication and conveying sometimes necessary, difficult communications in the workplace. It also works very much in any other relationships that we have, where if you have something difficult to say, you bring forth affirmation, then it's called the sandwich principle. You bring forth the affirmation, then you bring forth the difficult word, and you give affirmation again. You put the difficult verbiage within the sandwich of affirmation. And that is especially true when dealing with our spouse and in a marriage relationship. Remember, we made a commitment and a covenant together to honor and respect each other and actually build each other up. Because the reason we're doing that, remember that, the reason we're doing that is we're learning in our macro relationship, in our home that's here, we're learning how to establish the kingdom of God. We're actually learning how to fulfill Jesus' prayer when he said, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And this is our earth, this is our place that should be heaven, when unfortunately so often it turns out being hell. But that can change. And so we bring those principles into our relationships so that as a result of bringing those relationships, we can start having a mini demonstration of what heaven is like. communication, what it's like. But then as that is happening in the church, in the home, we can transfer that into the church. As it's transferred into the church, we can then transfer it into the community. As transferred into the community, we can start changing nations. Oh, but I want to be an evangelist. I just want to go out and transform nations right off the bat. Well, how's that working for you? Do not go on the attack when you're in a place of communication. Attacks come in a self-righteous tone. Almost always elicits defensiveness. They tend to be you statements instead of I statements. What do I mean by that? You always do that. You never do that. You always want your own way. You never do what I want to do. Immediately puts the other person on the defensive. Rather than saying, I would sure love for us to do this. Wouldn't it be fun if we did this or that? It's been a long time since we've gone out to eat. Wouldn't it be wonderful to do that? And I know sometimes finances can play a difficult time in this. I, being an only child, grew up in an adult world. I've never needed people. I create my own environment. I'm very happy with myself, and therefore, I hope you are too. If you're not, that's your problem. Get over it. My wife was raised in a community, being the baby of 14. She loves to have people around her. Never occurs to me to have anybody around. And so she'll say to me, don't you think it'd be nice if we went and visited so-and-so? Oh, yeah, never occurred to me. Or she'll say, man, how about if we have somebody over for dinner tonight or tomorrow night or whenever? She says, yeah, that sounds good to me. Never occurred to me to think about inviting somebody because I don't need the people around me to be happy as a clam. She does. But I have learned over the years, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. So I do my best to keep mama happy. And you know what happens? She does her best to keep daddy happy too. It just works that way. So it's important that we do not go on the attack. We don't try to correct our spouse, but much better way to do this is express how you're feeling about a decision that's about to be made. I statements rather than you statements. Do not exaggerate. Exaggeration is a way in which we vent our feelings when we're upset. This may relieve some inner tensions, but it doesn't work very much to produce marital harmony. I've told you 1,000,000 times to stop doing that. Don't exaggerate. Once your spouse hears any slight exaggeration in your part, he or she will feel fully justified in rejecting everything you have to say. Therefore, words such as always and never should be eliminated. Many years ago, the Lord taught me something that I've never forgotten, and I've taught it to many other people. And what he taught me was, I don't have the right to be right or the right to be wrong, but I have the privilege of hearing his voice. And so it's not a matter of who's right and who's wrong. It's a matter of having some respect and appreciation for each other's perspective. I could show you this piece of paper, and you would say, that's a blank sheet of paper. I said, no, there's lots of writing on it. No, that's a blank sheet of paper. You see, we're both right. And so what happens is that just because our spouse does not see things from our vantage point does not make either one of us right or wrong. It simply means we have a different perspective, and as we work with those different perspectives, we'll get the whole picture. Isn't that good? You still love me? Oh, how I wish we had a format where we could go into discussion mode here and just draw out from your different places of where you are. But that'll have to be for another time. Perhaps we'll have to come back and do a symposium sometime where we can really deal with get into some of these areas. Number 5, do not try to be a mind reader. Many people like to play amateur psychologists and figure out what others are thinking. However, if we assume that our estimates of our spouse's motives are completely accurate, we run the risk of completely misunderstanding them. Well, I know what you mean. I know what you want. No, let's not try to figure out what our spouse needs or wants until they've actually communicated that to us. Because even though, like I said, Marty and I have been married coming up on 48 years, and there are times we can actually finish each other's sentences. I can't read her mind, and she certainly can't read mine. But we don't try to. We're not afraid to ask questions. If we don't understand something, ask. Ask a question. Questions are allowed. Even the Lord invites us to ask questions of Him. We're allowed to ask questions, and He always answers them, sometimes with no. Focus on number 6, focus on your relationships, not just on principles. Because sometimes we pretend that our feelings are not as important as the principle that we're different about. But because of this, they try to convince each other through argument that their position is right. And this is why I said we should not focus on what's right and what's wrong, but we should focus on how is this affecting my relationship? How is it affecting the harmony in our relationship? How is it affecting how we're demonstrating the attributes and qualities of God's nature? How is that happening? How is that being affected by that? The 7th one is very important because you see what we need to do is we need to explain what made us feel the way we do. When something goes wrong and there's a conflict or there's a misunderstanding or something, it's very important that we express how we feel about what just happened. We may say, well, that's soulish, or that's carnal, or that's childish, or whatever. It doesn't matter what you call it. The reality is all of us have feelings. And the reality is that all of us have feelings that can be hurt and can be trampled over and can be put down, that we need to actually be able to articulate and make our spouses aware of this and understand this so we can communicate more effectively. Because what we're always trying to do is we're trying to meet each other in the most effective manner possible, because it's in that effective communication, and as we link together and are joined together in that depth of communication, she feels secure, he feels significant. Her love tank is met, her need is met, his need is met, and they live happily ever after, at least for the moment. So it's important. Communication are things that can be learned. We can learn how to become better communicators. All of us need to be learning. All of us need to be actually putting into practice areas and things that enable us to become better communicators. Clarify your needs. Clarify your needs. In other words, you'll not be able to get what you want from your spouse unless you're able to articulate exactly what your needs are. You see, that's why it's so important to make sure your spouse is listening. You actually have their attention. Some years back, there was a couple in their 50s who he was all wrapped up in making money, and his focus was money, making money, money, money. He actually ended up serving Mammon. But he was just neglecting his wife big time, and she was trying to make her needs known, and she was trying to get his attention, and he would just focus on, he got it reading this book about money or watching this program on TV about money, and she just couldn't get his attention. And so she devised a plan how she could get his attention. She, you know what those little, they look like a little trampoline, they're like a little round, they call them rebounders or something like that. They had one of those. So what she did, he was deeply engrossed in his TV program. And so what she did is she went into the bedroom and she put on her most sheer negligee, and she rolled out the rebounder in front of the TV, and she started jumping up and down in front of the TV. She got his attention. Sometimes things call for desperate measures. You laugh because you can identify with it. We might have a rush on rebounder sales or something else. Do not assume that your spouse knows what you need just because you're married. Communication does not stop when you say, I do. What that actually means is I do communicate. I do continue to honor and love you. Now, when you're dealing with issues in the marriage relationship, to limit yourself to just one or two primary concerns. The reason for that is this. Sometimes what happens is, especially wives, they have such a long list of unmet needs and grievances that have not been heard by their spouse. They've been stuffed down inside, and after a while there's a big explosion, and she has to get it out, and she has to get all these things out. And so then you want to talk about a dozen different issues that have been unresolved for the last 6 months. But that's not the way to do it. Because when you start wanting to help things along, after about the second or third issue that is brought up, you're losing your spouse's attention. And not only that, if the spouse is a slow processor, like in our the symposium we just did, one of the couples was saying, he put up his hand and says, I am a slow processor. He said, I need a couple days for it. If my wife gives me more than two things, I go tilt, and I don't hear anything else she says after that. And that's really true. That's really true with a lot of people. There's nothing wrong with you intellectually. It just simply means you have learned to process things in a different way than what your spouse does. And so you learn how to pick your time. You need to learn how to talk about the things that are our priority, and deal with just one or two issues at a time. Talk about those. Get resolution to those so that you can then move on to other things a little farther down the line. But it's very important that we limit ourselves to just a couple of those concerns so that we can actually get closure and get real connectivity in those couple of areas. And last one of the 10 points that I wanted to bring out here is that to allow time for questions after presenting your concerns. Stop speaking before your spouse loses patience and allow him or her to ask questions. And allowing for questions assures that your concerns have been fully understood. Questions give you the opportunity to clarify what you have said. This is really a judicial procedure that you present what your needs are, you give time for the rebuttal, and then after the rebuttal, you have a moment of clarification which was not understood. Anything goes beyond that goes into argument. And when you go into an argument, It's like the adage that says, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. The longer you argue, the more concrete your point of reasoning becomes. And the less you will hear reason as to why you should change your position. And so arguing is really pointless long term. It does not resolve anything. All it does is add frustration to an already volatile circumstance or situation. So it's important that we learn to communicate in an effective way. We're actually meeting and connecting with each other. Just a couple of quick guidelines here for creating a safe emotional space, because we need to have safe emotional space. Again, we're talking about relationships. We're talking about kingdom relationships. We're talking about healthy kingdom relationships. And so there's a couple points that I have here. We're continuously work on improving our communication skills. This can be done through research, through reading, through just simply allowing yourself to be transparent and vulnerable with your spouse and learning to communicate, learning to use more I statements rather than you statements, because, as I said, a you statement almost always is experienced as an attack. So we have to minimize those you statements when we're in a area of conflict or where we have a different point of view. We need to take responsibility to express our own needs clearly. Trust breaks down when a spouse feels that he or she cannot express their needs to another spouse. In other words, if I'm trying to, or if Marty's trying to talk to me and I never give her the undivided attention and time she needs to express what's in her heart and her heart that she feels she needs to express, she feels invalidated, causes stress, causes anxiety, causes frustration, and after a while she just closes up. And therefore she'll just lock it down and talk to somebody else about it. Then when I find out about it as a husband, when we find out our wives have shared some of our stuff with one of her girlfriends, then I really get angry. Why? Because I'm no longer significant in her eyes or in my own. And so that's why it's important for us to learn to communicate and express our needs clearly, so that, and the reason we don't express our needs is usually for two reasons. Either we're afraid of rejection, or we're afraid of feeling ashamed for having such needs. That's why it has to be a safe place. I said that's the reason it needs to be a safe place, because if we're unable to express it, we're either afraid of rejection, and who likes rejection? We're either afraid of rejection or ashamed of having such needs. Many years ago, in the early years of our marriage, Marty would try to express something to me, and I'd say, grow up, get over it, or whatever. I would not allow her, because you see, I hadn't learned yet. I was a quick processor. You know, you ask me a question, I've got 2 or 3 answers lined up, see which one's appropriate for you back in those days. And she was a slower processor, and I had not yet learned how to give her the space she needed to make her feel validated in her expression, and therefore she would stuff things. After a while, her stuffer got filled up. And so it's important that we have a safe environment where we can actually express the deepest needs of our heart to our spouse and feel safe in doing that. Be positive and give pleasure. As I've said several times, all of our relationships are based in pleasure or pain. We naturally tend to trust people who treat us nicely and who seem to like us. It's very hard to distrust someone who goes out of his way to please you. So what we do with couples, we had a situation just recently where it's the 5-to-1 rule. We usually drop it to 3-to-1 or something like that. But we had a couple just recently they were at absolute odds. She was told her husband, she called him up and told him, when you come home tonight, your clothes are going to be on the outside. We're done. And, you know, we had been working with her, with them, and we thought we were making some good progress. And then another flare-up happened. And so they came in again, and we started talking, and she was on a roll, absolutely on a roll, about all the things, the shortcomings of her husband. And finally, I put my talking stick up. My turn. And I said, I'd like for you to think about 3 things that you generally love about this man and you generally appreciate, and some of the things that caused you to say I do at the marriage altar. She instantly changed. Her attitude instantly changed, and she had 3 things that she loved and appreciated about her husband. Before the session was over, they were sitting next to each other because we had just simply what's the word I'm looking for? We had disengaged the argument. We had disengaged the problem because we put their focus on not what was wrong, but on what was right. If we can learn to do that and just start focusing on things we genuinely appreciate about each other and start stroking our spouse in that direction, it's amazing the transformation that can take place in a relationship very quickly. The 5-to-1 rule. In other words, you give 5 positive points to 1 negative one. Lastly, don't allow issues to go unresolved. There's a reason why the Scripture tells us not to allow the sun to go down on our wrath. There's a reason for that. Because you see, if you let it go down on if you go to bed angry, you're going to wake up angry. Because I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but your last thoughts at night are your first thoughts you wake up with. And so if you don't resolve the issue before you go to bed, you're going to wake up with an unresolved issue hanging over your head. Oh, that rhymes. I'm a poet and don't know it. So not allowing issues to go unresolved, it means that we need to learn to disagree respectfully. Respectfully. Remember that any true relationship is built in respect and trust. And so we need to learn to disagree respectfully. Disagreement is a part of any good marriage. Dealt with a couple here some time ago that had teenage sons. And they said, I don't know what to do. He says, my teenagers kick in doors. They got pounded. They knock holes in the wall, and they're just angry. And I don't know where our wits end, what to do with our teenagers. And so I said to him, how do you and your wife resolve conflicts? Well, we go into our bedroom, we talk it out, we get it worked out, and then we get it all settled, and we never argue in front of our children. I said, well, that's your first mistake. Because how do you expect that your children are going to learn how to resolve conflicts if you don't demonstrate it for them? Disagreements are part of marriage. Why? Because it stretches us, causes us to consider another perspective. It causes us to have long-suffering and patience and endurance and some of those other qualities that make God who He is. Remember, we're here to represent Him in our sphere of influence. We're here to represent Father to creation. Hallelujah. If we can't do it at home, we're kidding ourselves that we can do it anywhere else. We tell young people, young ministries, we tell them this. I don't know how many young people who are called into ministry in various degrees. How many I've told this over the years, I don't know. It's been a lot of them. I said, listen, I'm going to tell you something. Your wife is your first church. Your children are your converts. And anything God gives you beyond that's bonus. That's your church. That's why the Bible says if you can't rule well at home, how can you rule in the church? Have your house in order. Have your wife happy. Have her be fully supportive. Have her blossoming. Because you see, the woman is the glory of the man. My wife is an expression of who I am. If I'm not meeting her needs, she's not going to look fulfilled. She's not going to be happy. She's going to be under stress. She's not going to age as beautifully as she does. Polish my halo a little bit. But no, seriously, the woman is the glory of the man. Females will be an expression of the prominent male in their life, whether it's a daughter or a spouse, or if you're single, it's a little bit more difficult, but then you're generally reflecting either an ex-husband or a father, and how you were raised and how you were developed in that. Our disrespect destroys trust. A few pointers on how to disagree respectfully, then we're going to take a break. Do not resort to name-calling or put-downs. Keep to the issue at hand. Don't bring up old, unresolved issues. Boy, that's a deadly one. You try to work with something that's a current issue, and the first thing that you hear is, well, last month or 6 weeks ago, last year, you remember what you said to me last year? That was last year. Don't use phrases such as you never or you always. In other words, you statements. Use more I statements. I will, I feel, I won't. Never bring the in-laws into the issue to support your case. Well, that's the way we've always done it. That's the way I was raised. Well, maybe you should have stayed home and continued the raising process. Take time out of the disagreement if the disagreement gets argumentative. We often tell couples, take a cooling off period. You start getting heated, stop. Before you start hurting each other emotionally, just stop. The issue is not that important. Because the issue is not the issue is the relationship. Take time out. Give it a couple days. Pray about it. Think about it. Come back, discuss it again when you're not heated up about it. Don't try to resolve a disagreement when you're both tired. Trust takes a long time to build, but how many of us know it takes a short time to destroy? And so it's very important that we learn that we continually need to be building. Be careful how you treat each other. Many couples wrongly believe that in a good marriage you can relax and not monitor everything you say and do. Did I talk about being sons and daughters of God? I don't think I did. This comes in a little bit in the next little block that I want to do, but I just want to talk about it here now because I feel it fits right here. One of the things that we do when couples are really at loggerheads with each other and seem like they've reached an impasse is we say, in life, in your marriage relationship, there are 3 levels of relationship. 2 of those levels are eternal. One of them is temporary. I said, as Christians, you're both a son and a daughter of God, then your brother and sister, spiritually speaking, and then your husband and wife. And I said, what the first accountability that you're going to give when you stand before God and give an account of your life is, the first question that you're going to be asked from the Father is, how did you treat one of my daughters? Did you treat her with respect? Did you treat her with honor? How did you treat my son? Did you honor him? Did you respect him? Because you see, we have to realize that we are actually a son and a daughter of God. And therefore, we need to treat each other that way. Secondly is then, how did you treat your sister, or how did you treat your husband, your sister or your brother? And then thirdly is, how did you do in your marriage? Because those first 2 are eternal relationships. The third one is a temporary relationships that's designed for our pleasure, our companionship, our revealing who God the Father is and for procreation. The other 2 are eternal. And so it's very important that we keep things in the right perspective. And usually when we really press some of those things home, into the spirit of the people that we're dealing with, they're ready to talk business. They're ready to kind of resolve some issues real quickly because they come to a realization and a revelation of the accountability that they have. So, the key to building a strong, the key to a good marriage is to build a strong, healthy, and a trusting relationship, which is also the key of experiencing the quality of marriage that God intended, and is also the key of being able to more fully and accurately demonstrate and represent who God is